Hey there, I'm a DIY track guy, and this is my humble, finally running Ecotec Miata. When I started the Ecotec Miata swap about 6 months ago, it was a project I wanted to do for the sake of car passion. As explained in a previous video, I started wheel-to-wheel racing these cars in 2015, and I always wanted one of my own, or rather, to build one of my own. I've been driving on track and DIY wrenching on cars for maybe 20 years, and although I've done a lot of modifications to cars, I've never undertaken a project like this where I'd need to remove and replace the most major component. And it's not just the motor itself, this swap requires touching many components on the car that I've never wrenched on before, certainly not by myself in my own garage. To me, the prospect of this swap was both exhilarating and a little scary. This is a 1990 Mazda MX-5 Miata, if I haven't mentioned it already. OG edition. This was the first production year of this car, and in fact, this particular one has a production build date of August 1989, which makes this young lady over 33 years old. From the factory, it developed 116 horsepower to the crank and a mere 100 pound-foot of torque. And after 170-ish thousand kilometers of driving, the motor was a bit down on power and it leaked oil. Quite a lot. But now with this GM 2.4-liter LE5 4-cylinder, this Ecotec motor is rated with 169 horsepower and 160 torque at the crank, on the factory tune. Now I can understand that you may be disappointed with that. Compared to today's production cars, that's pretty underwhelming. And compared to the insane builds that routinely pop up on our social media feeds of 400, 500, 1,000 horsepower, I can almost hear the collective, "Why even bother, bro?" It's no secret that the Miata's magic, its special sauce, its je ne sais quoi, is its lightweight, low power, and brilliant handling. Now, changing out the 1.6-liter Mazda motor for this GM unit has definitely changed the characteristics of the car, but I would argue it hasn't changed its character. The sounds and vibrations of the Ecotec aren't a one-to-one equivalency to the 1.6 Mazda motor. As soon as you hit the ignition on the first crank, it's clearly not. There's a slightly higher pitched metal-on-metal sound as the starter thumps over. And once the motor fires up, the harmonics it produces are less refined, less sewing machine than the B6 Mazda unit. And when you do bring up the revs, it doesn't smooth out in that precision Japanese tight tolerance sort of way. It has a more low-end grunt, V6 truck-like quality to it, more red, white, and blue American. Although there are differences, I'd have to say that the character of the Miata is still retained with this engine swap. In terms of weight, the Ecotec motor is all aluminum, while the engine it replaced was an aluminum head with an iron block. And while I don't have the exact numbers handy, I understand that they're within a few pounds of each other. We also have the same number of cylinders, 4. And we also don't have any of the forced induction gear up there, like the turbo, intercooler, plumbing, and all the other associated bits. So the essential Miata 50-50 front to rear weight balance is retained, as well as the simplicity of the naturally aspirated motor. And that naturally aspirated American 4-banger is actually quite potent. There are many variants of the Ecotec, and this 2.4-liter one is the largest displacement of its generation. I feel like they're kind of slept on, especially compared to the engine swap du jour, the Honda K series, which I love and in fact have in my daily driver. But the Ecotec actually does have a lot of potential. In fact, GM put spicier versions into some models like the Chevy Cobalt SS and some Pontiacs. Not to mention Polaris used the Ecotec in their 3-wheel motorbike car thing called the Slingshot, so at least to a degree they're not completely without performance pedigree. As mentioned in a previous video, the 170-ish horsepower from this Ecotec motor really wakes up this chassis and gives it the power that the Miata needs. And we know this because after nearly 30 years, Mazda finally saw fit to revise their Skyactiv G motor to produce almost the same amount with 181 horsepower in the 2018 ND2 MX-5 Miata. But adding this modest amount of power to this OG platform addresses the most criticized and panned aspect of this particular model, its anemic lack of power. And that's with the stock tune. The nice thing about the E67 ECU, which is the brains behind many garden variety GM motors, including the LS3 and LS9 V8 ones, is that it's programmable by engine tuners and can be dyno tuned for your particular application and unique set of mods. Using a specialty bit of software called HP Tuners, a skilled pro or even a home DIY tuner can adjust its various parameters for your desired performance needs depending on your modifications and fuel type. That means I'm not necessarily stuck at that 170 horsepower figure. If I chose, I could do some mods for a healthy increase in power, like working over the cylinder head, replacing the cams, springs, even building the bottom end. All those cool engine builder things that could net mid-200s and beyond, all on the stock ECU. But even simply tuning my current setup as is will likely make around 200 crank horsepower and 200 torque, which is a fun and usable amount of power on a lightweight rear-wheel drive chassis. Another nice thing about this swap is that you get to retain the stock Miata transmission, which feels great. This one's a 6-speed unit out of an NB2 and is manufactured by ASIN. I understand that this is an AZ6 variant that you might find in an S2000, BRZ, FRS, GT86, or maybe even an S15 Sylvia, but I don't think that they're cross-compatible. In any case, it's a lovely shifting transmission, and it's nice that we get to keep it with this swap. The Ecotec swap allows you to keep not only the stock Miata transmission, but also the downstream driveline components like the drive shaft, differential, axles, and hubs. But critically, it retains the PPF, which ties the entire engine, transmission, and differential together as a unit. And the Ecotec bolts up to the stock Miata subframe, which means the suspension and steering geometry can be left alone. For the uninitiated, it might seem like insignificant details, but Mazda engineers spent a lot of time designing and developing these critical components that underpin the dynamic handling and characteristics that unmistakably make a Miata a Miata. And keeping these stock parts means it reduces the overall cost and effort required to accomplish the swap. And it all comes together quite nicely. Yeah, it's not exactly like a more powerful version of the motor that it replaces, but I feel like the Ecotec is a good spiritual match to the Miata. It's unassuming, economical, modest, and bottom line, it's comfortable with what it is. The somewhat tired but apt saying, Miata is always the answer, still applies here. Not only is it budget-friendly, lightweight, and instructive to drive, it's also super easy to learn to wrench on, and as a first-time engine swapper myself, the unintimidating Ecotec has been an ideal build for me to develop new skills, grow my knowledge, challenge myself, and unlock an achievement in my car passion journey. You're awesome, I'm useless, thanks for watching.